Welcome to the Dire Wolf Show, where we believe that America is exceptional and that our constitutional rights should never be infringed. I am Dire Wolf. On our show, we bring you the truth and debunk fake news. If you love laughing at the insanity of the regressive left, sit back and relax. Boy, do I have a show for you.
All right. Well, welcome back, Wolfpack. This is Fox Trevize here. I am taking over tonight. A rare occasion that has not happened for a while. Also, do not have very much of a script for this intro, so I guess we'll see how this goes. All right. So I wanted to do something a little bit different with you guys tonight. Something I've wanted to do for a while, and I know the last 2 weeks have been well, there's been a certain story that's taken the American heart by storm, so to speak. But there's other issues here at home, and a lot of people have discussed the idea that some of what is going on abroad, some of our foreign entanglements, have distracted us from the issues going on here at home. Now, that's not to say that our foreign entanglements are unimportant, but we, even taking 2 weeks off of scrutinizing what it is that our quote-unquote better men, our elected officials, the elites, so to speak, even taking 2 weeks break, not focusing on what they're doing here at home, boy, oh boy, are they pretty busy. So, we're not going to be talking much about them tonight, though. What we have tonight is a little story. Let's see here. Oops. It's not what I wanted, guys. Okay. There we go. So what we have tonight is a story that I'm going to be reading to you. It is a story that was written a long time ago, and when they wrote it a long time ago, they thought that it would be taking place a long time from now. But I think, as you guys will see tonight, that perhaps a long time from now is not quite so far away. But before we get into the story, I want to point out real quickly 3 recent news stories. So we have from the, and I want you guys to remember these news stories while we're reading through our other story that I'm going to read to you. So we have from the Wall Street Journal. The House passes the $3.5 trillion budget and sets deadlines for the infrastructure bill. Now, the infrastructure bill was recently passed this week. Or at least it got through its first big hurdle. And while it says that it is $3.5 trillion, a lot of estimates have pegged it at closer to $6.5 trillion. And that's sort of over the course of 10 years. And as you guys know, government projects always come in under budget. That is $3.5 or $6.5 trillion that we do not currently have. All of that is slated to be borrowed or wrung from you, the taxpayer, like a dry rag. Our next story is the Consumer Price Index. So it was a story that we talked about in the show a few weeks ago, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics put the Consumer Price Index at 5.4%, which is a little over 5%, which is widely considered to be, when people are referring to inflation, they're referring to this number. So inflation in July was 5.4%, or a little over 5%. We have the debt ceiling. So from Bloomberg Businessweek, the debt ceiling farce is a headache investors could do without. And while the first few paragraphs here are a little poetic, perhaps, the key one here is right now. This is from August 9th. Right now, the debt ceiling is about $28.4 trillion, and the U.S. Treasury's fancy footwork on accounting should keep the U.S. borrowing authority officially intact for a little while. So what happened during COVID was, instead of extending the debt ceiling, Congress just completely removed the brakes and suspended the debt ceiling until August 1st of this. So that was this month, the beginning of the month, the debt ceiling kicked back in. And Janet Yellen, who is the current Treasury Secretary, had to figure out how to handle that because we're at the edge. We are unable to borrow anymore. And as Bloomberg so poetically points out, the U.S. Treasury has some fancy footwork on accounting. Now, if you or I try to do some fancy footwork in our accounting, we wouldn't be at the head of the U.S. Treasury, I can tell you that. Some of the fancy footwork, again, just to... You guys can go look up these stories in your own time if you would like. Maybe we'll cover them on a show eventually, but just kind of priming the pump here before we go into our other story that I'm going to read for you today. The fancy footwork that the U.S. Treasury is doing currently, because they're at the edge of the debt limit, they cannot spend any more unless they sell something. So among those things that they're selling is various government assets. They have suspended investments into federal pension plans. They have put some more IOUs into Social Security. And there's a few other levers that they can pull. They estimate that there is about $380 billion worth of quote-unquote fancy footwork accounting that they can do before we default on our debt. And that's the big key here, is defaulting on the debt, because we're at the edge of the debt ceiling. Now, some people might say that the debt ceiling is an imaginary thing and we could just expand it and then we won't default on our debt. Sure. But the key thing is that we are currently having to do fancy footwork on our accounting to prevent us from defaulting on our debt. So, again, 3 stories. Massive spending, massive inflation, and the U.S. possibly defaulting on our debt. So, what is our story tonight? Well, the story I have for you tonight is an excerpt. Actually, it's a whole chapter. I'm going to read to you the entire chapter, chapter 25, from the book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Now, some of you guys might know this already, but for those of you that don't, The Creature from Jekyll Island is a book about the Federal Reserve. It's a book about the years leading up to the Federal Reserve. It's a book about the people that created the Federal Reserve. It's about how the law that created the Federal Reserve was passed on, I believe, Christmas Eve, 1913. I might be mistaken on that. With a very minimal quorum, as most Congress people were at home that day. And so a very, very small amount of people actually voted on this, kind of like a lot of things the Democrats want to do in the dead of night. And they snuck it in there. And we've been dealing with it ever since. Now, this book was written originally in 1994. And it is currently 2021, a couple years later. So this chapter here, so this whole book goes through the history of all the stuff about the Federal Reserve, all the things that they don't want you to really know about. It explains all of the previous times in history that humanity has attempted centralized banking, and it hasn't worked. And the chapter I'm going to read to you today, well, it also goes through and explains some of the problems with that. The chapter I'm going to read for you today, chapter 25, out of The Creature from Jekyll Island, is a unique chapter in the book. It is not a history. It's not well-researched. It's not fact-finding or teaching. It's merely meant to be a fictional narrative, well, what the author hoped would be a fictional narrative, about what the future would hold for the United States if nothing was done about the Federal Reserve. And it's interesting because he wrote this in, again, 1994. And I'm going to read it to you today. And you're going to be a little bit terrified of some of the things that you're hearing in this story, because it sounds a little similar to what's going on today, which is a real big problem, because when I get to the end of the story, you're really not going to like the end of the story. But I don't want to ruin it, so why don't I just start reading it? But first, I'm going to crack open a beer here. All right. So, normally when I'm reading script for you guys on the show. I'm reading it off a computer screen, and it's in an appropriate space where my eyes are. Today I'm going to be reading out of an actual book, like with paper pages and ink, and I have to touch it. It's a little bit weird for me, being a millennial, but I'm going to do my best. So, here we go. So, chapter 25 from The Creature from Jekyll Island. A pessimistic scenario. This chapter remains exactly as first published in 1994. The original, whimsical look into the future has become an incredibly accurate portrayal many real events since then. A banking crisis and a massive bailouts have already come to pass. The still unfolding scenario includes hyperinflation, a collapse of the economy, and a new global currency, domestic violence, UN peacekeeping forces in the U.S., and the arrival of high-tech feudalism. So, our story begins. A banking crisis. It is 4:05 in the morning. While New York City sleeps, the computers on the 4th floor of Citibank are aware that a full-blown crisis is underway. It started in London, 5 hours ahead of the East Coast, and within minutes it had spread like an electronic virus to Tokyo and Hong Kong. That was an hour ago. Alarms are now sounding on computer terminals in all the trading centers of the world, and automatic dialing devices are summoning money managers to their boardrooms. The panic started from rumors that one of the large U.S. banks was in trouble because of the simultaneous default of its loans to Mexico and the bankruptcy of its second largest corporate borrower. Yesterday afternoon, the bank's president held a press conference and denied that these were serious problems. To reinforce his optimism, he announced that on Friday, the bank will be paying a higher than usual quarterly dividend. The professional money managers were not convinced. They knew that writing off these loans would wipe out the bank's entire net worth. By 5 a.m., the money center banks are facing heavy withdrawals from overseas depositors. By the time the sun peaks between New York's skyscrapers, Americans are also taking their money. These are not small transactions. They involve other banks, insurance companies, and investment funds. The average withdrawal is over $3 million. Their reservoir is draining fast. It is now 7:45. The banks will soon be opening their doors, and already newspaper reporters and TV crews are arriving outside. A plan of unified action must be made quickly. The chairman of the Federal Reserve has arranged an emergency conference call with the CEOs of all the major banks, including one who is located at great effort at his fishing lodge in northern Canada. The president is also tied into the phone call network, but on a silent monitor basis. Other than the chairman, no one else knows that he's listening. To save the banks is to save the world. The CEO at Citibank quickly surmises the problem. None of the banks will be able to sustain withdrawals of this magnitude for more than about 48 hours, perhaps less. The money is not in their vaults. It has been put into interest-bearing loans. Even if the loans were performing, they would not have the money. Now that some of the larger loans are in default, the problem is even worse. If the Fed doesn't provide the money, the banks will have no choice but to close their doors and go out of business. That would cause a collapse of the economy, and untold suffering would follow. Americans would be thrown out of work, families would go hungry, national security would be weakened. And it would undoubtedly spread to the entire world. Who knows what dire consequences would follow? Chaos, famine, riots, and here at home, revolution abroad, the return of a militaristic regime in Russia, atomic war even. The chairman cuts the monologue short. He is well aware that the bank must not be allowed to fail. That, after all, was one of the reasons the Federal Reserve was created. He wants to get on with the details of how to do it. Yes, the FDIC already broke, but don't worry about that. Congress will authorize a, quote, loan. or some other mechanism for the Fed to create whatever amount of new money the FDIC might need. If Congress moves too slowly, the Fed has other technical means to accomplish the same result. In the meantime, unlimited funding will be available at the Fed's discount window by 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The printing presses are already running at full capacity to provide the currency. Fleets of airplanes and armored cars are standing by to deliver it. Furthermore, don't give up on these defaulted loans. Congress will probably bail out the bankrupt American corporations. And the president has said he will ask for additional funding for the IMF/World Bank. That money will be created by the Fed and carry the stipulation that it must be used by Mexico and other defaulting countries to resume interest payments on their loans. The bankers are told to open their doors to the public and act calm. The press already knows that something is going on, but not the seriousness of it. So tell them only what they already know, nothing more. If people want to withdraw their money, give it to them. If lines should develop, call the police to maintain order, but continue paying out. Offer to stay open after closing hours, if necessary, to accommodate everyone. Above all, have the tellers take their time, check and double-check each transaction. Move the lines forward slowly. The armored trucks will arrive at the busiest hours so that the guards can carry sacks of money past the customers for visual confirmation that there is enough for everyone. A bank officer then should tell the crowd that a fresh delivery of money has just been made from the Federal Reserve System and that there is plenty more where that came from. Once people become convinced that the bank is able to pay, most of them will tire of the wait and go home. Panic averted. It is now 6 p.m. on the following day. The plan was successful. Lines of anxious depositors had formed yesterday morning, mostly in the larger cities, and resumed again this morning. But there has been enough money for everyone. The news media treated the story lightly, making sure to include sound bites from various experts that the banks could no longer fail, thanks to the FDIC and the Federal Reserve System. More than half the video time is devoted to armored trucks. More than half the video time is devoted to armored trucks and guards carrying sacks of money. The banks closed on schedule today, and there were no more lines. While everything appears calm to the passengers on deck, the fire still rages out of control in the boiler room. Over $1 billion has already fled, mostly overseas, and the hemorrhaging continues. The Fed is pumping in fresh money to replace it. 2 of the banks have instructed their computer technicians to activate an automatic 2-hour delay on all incoming transactions. There is talk of deliberately disabling the entire network and blaming the breakdown on an overload, but the idea is abandoned. There are too many people in the system. Someone would surely leak the truth to the press. The danger of a run on the banks is by private depositors used. The danger of a run on the banks by private depositors used to be the nightmares of the Federal Reserve. Now it is nothing compared to the electronic run that is taking place involving institutional depositors around the world. These are professionals who are not impressed by armored guards carrying bags of currency. They want their money now, and they are getting it. Although they are receiving it in the form of electronic credits, they are immediately exchanging that for something more dependable, such as stocks or other currencies and bullion. This is the Fed's finest hour. It is exercising its many powers, carefully accumulated over the years, to create money out of whatever is at hand. U.S. Treasury bonds, bonds from other governments, corporate debt obligations, even direct loans to individuals and partnerships. Billions of new dollars are sprinting into existence. They are spreading around the globe to fulfill the bank's obligations and to give the people back their money. A real run on the banks. It is now 7 weeks later. Something happened, but no one knows what. Like a spark igniting a twig, spreading to a branch, and then engulfing the entire forest, the public has panicked. Responding to a primitive herding instinct, they are descending on the banks and the thrifts. They want their money. They want their savings. Perhaps it was the newly released statistics showing higher unemployment, or the continued rise in bankruptcies, or the congressional vote to increase the national debt again, or the jump in the Social Security taxes, or the loans of another, or the loss of another 140,000 jobs to Mexico, or the riots in Chicago and Detroit for more food stamps and government housing, or the presence of UN peacekeeping troops to augment the National Guard, or the rumor that the Bank of America was technically insolvent, or the UN World Court ruling that the number of American automobiles had to be cut by 30% by December 31st, or the skeptical tone in the voice of the CBS news anchor as he quoted the latest prediction of renewed prosperity. Whatever it was, there are now long lines of sober-faced depositors outside every bank. There is not enough cash in the vaults to meet the demand. The money is mostly checkbook money, which means it consists merely of magnetic impulses in a computer. Only about 5% of the monetary supply is in the form of coins or paper currency. Most of that is already outside the banks, in the cash registers, the wallets, and the mattresses. The amount inside the banks is only about 0.5%. The Fed's emergency supply of paper currency, a large quantity warehoused for exactly this kind of crisis, is inadequate. This time, the printing presses cannot keep up. Spokesmen from the Treasury and the Federal Reserve appear on TV and assure the nation that there is no need to panic. Everything is under control. The only problem is the irrational behavior of alarmists who have no faith in their country. No one believes them. The lines are growing, and the people become angry. Bank employees are jeered at on their way to work. Bomb threats are made. Sporadic violence breaks out, and bank windows are smashed. The International Guard is called up. The president declares a banking holiday. Since people cannot close out of their bank accounts by withdrawing currency, they rush to the stores on checkbook spending sprees. If they cannot get their money back in paper currency, at least they can buy things with it. Garages and basements are filling up with canned goods, shoes, liquor, tires, ammunition. Goods are becoming scarce, pushing prices upwards. The Dow Jones is going through the roof as investors empty their checking accounts to buy anything that is for sale. The Security and Exchanges Commissions finally suspend trading. It is now 9 months later. The crisis has been a blessing for the politicians. They have thrived upon it and grown in stature. Grown in stature because of it. It has given them an excuse to swarm through the country on fact-finding trips, to appear in shirt sleeves at town hall meetings, to give speeches, and to be seen on television. All the time expressing grave concern and appearing to take charge. It has legitimized their role and somehow made them seem more necessary than before. They have been converted in the public eye from oafs and bumpkins to serious-minded statesmen. The party in power said it inherited the mess. The previous party blamed the current one for dropping the ball. Both parties, however, agreed on the solution. More of exactly the same policies that created the crisis. Expanded power to the Federal Reserve, more government control over the economy, more subsidies and benefits, and more international commitments. These were called, quote, emergency reforms, and then they became law. The same men who created the problem prescribed the solution. The public was grateful to have leaders with such wisdom and wisdom. Such vision and wisdom. Bank bailout and more inflation. The most important emergency reform was to bail out the banks with taxpayers' dollars. Defaulted foreign loans were taken over by the IMF and the World Bank, and the failing corporate borrowers were given government grants disguised as loans. Loans which everyone knew they would never pay back. Next, the banks were nationalized, at least in part. In return for the bailout money, they gave large blocks of preferred stock to the government, which now operates as an official business partner. This was not a drastic change. The banks were already heavily regulated by government, even to the point of determining their profits, dividends, and executive salaries. This is the way the cartel wanted it, though. It was the means by which competition was avoided and profits assured. Monetary scientists and political scientists have always worked as a hidden partnership. This merely made the relationship more visible. Technically, no bank was allowed to fail. The Fed kept its promise on that. When the troubled banks were taken over, all depositors with $100,000 or less were fully protected. If they wanted their money and the bank didn't have it, the Fed simply manufactured it. No one was worried about the value of those dollars. They were just happy to have them. It is now 10 more months later. Those new dollars are flooding through the system. The money supply has increased by the amount of the bailout, plus the amount of the new spending for welfare, health care, interest on the national debt, foreign aid, all of which are in vertical climb. Inflation has become institutionalized. The dollar has been dethroned as the world's de facto currency. Foreign investors and central banks no longer have any use for dollars. They have sent them all back to the United States, whence they came. Trillions of them have returned to our shores, like a huge flock of homing pigeons that fills the sky from horizon to horizon. They are buying our refrigerators, our automobiles, our computers, our airplanes, our cargo ships, our armored tanks, office buildings, factories, real estate, pushing prices to levels that would have seemed impossible years ago. A single postage stamp now costs as many dollars as it would have once. A single postage stamp costs as many dollars as once would have purchased a new TV set. Most stores have stopped accepting checks and credit cards. Workers are paid daily with bundles of paper money. People rush to the stores to purchase groceries before prices rise even further. Commerce is paralyzed. Bank loans and mortgages are unobtainable. Savings accounts have been destroyed, including the cash values of insurance policies. Factories are shutting down. Businesses are closing their doors. Barter is commonplace. Old silver coins come out of private hoards, and a $100 bill is exchanged for one silver dime. Following the crash of 1929, the supply of paper money was limited. It was backed by silver, and the amount of silver itself was limited. Those who had money were able to buy up the assets of those who did not have money. Since prices were falling, the longer they held on to their dollars, the more they could buy. Now things are the exact opposite. There is nothing to back the money supply except politics. There is no limit to the amount of currency that can be created. It is just a question of printing and delivering it. Money is abundant and prices are rising. Those who have money are spending it as soon as possible to prevent further loss of purchasing power. In the 1930s, everyone wanted dollars. Now, everyone wants to get rid of them. The Emergency Banking Regulation Number 1, Regulation Number 1, originally issued in 1961, empowered the Secretary of the Treasury without consent of the Congress, might mention, to seize anyone's bank account, savings account, or safe deposit box. It also gave them the power to fix rents, fix salaries, fix prices, fix hourly wages, and to impose rationing. This was to be done in, quote, the event of an attack on the United States of America. That phrase has now been changed to read, quote, in the event of a national emergency. The Federal Emergency Mandate Agency, FEMA, has been expanded to administer the directives of the Treasury. FEMA also has the power to detain and forcibly relocate any citizen, quote, in the event of a national emergency. New money. There are 3 more months that have passed, and the president has declared a state of national emergency. Today, the Secretary of the Treasury announced that the nations of the world have ratified a multilateral treaty that would solve the inflation problems of the United States. This will be accomplished through the issuance of a new one worldwide currency, a new monetary unit called the Bancor. The name proposed by John Maynard Keynes of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. This new money will restore our commerce and put a stop to the inflation. At last, the Treasury Secretary, man will have total control over his economic destiny. Money will now become his servant instead of his master. The United States, he says, has agreed to accept the Bancor as legal tender for all debts, public and private. The old money will still be honored, but will be phased out over a 3-month period. After that date, Federal Reserve notes will no longer be valid. During the transition period, the old money may be exchanged at any bank at the ratio of 1 Bancor per 500 US dollars. All existing contracts expressed in dollars, including home mortgages, are now converted to Bancors at the same ratio. In the same announcement, the Secretary of the Treasury advised that the IMF and World Bank was backing this new money with something far more precious than gold. Instead, it will be backed by the assets of the world. These include bonds from the participating governments, plus millions of acres of wilderness lands that have been deposited into the UN Environmental Bank. I'm going to reread that one. This includes bonds from the participating governments, plus millions of acres of wilderness that have been deposited into the UN Environmental Bank. The national parks and forests of the United States have been added to those reserves, and they will now be under the supervision of the UN Wilderness Asset Preservation and Enhancement Agency, WAPIA. From this date forward, the Federal Reserve System will operate as a subdivision of the IMF, which is now the central bank of the world. Although the Secretary of the Treasury did not mention it in his public appearance, the United Nations Treaty has also obligated the government to put restrictions on the use of that new cash. Every citizen is to be issued an international ID card. Every citizen is to be issued an international ID card. The primary purpose of these machine-readable cards is to provide positive identification for all citizens at transportation depots and military checkpoints. They also can be used by the banks and stores to access checking accounts, which are now called debit accounts. Every citizen is being issued an account in a bank near his place of residence. All payments by employers or government agencies will be made by electronic transfer. Cash transactions larger than 5 bancors will be illegal in 3 months. Most expenditures will be paid by debit card. That is now the only way in which the UN Monetary Transaction Tracking Agency can combat counterfeiting and prevent money laundering by organized crime. That, of course, is camouflage. The government complex issuing the new money is the greatest perpetrator of counterfeiting and organized crime the world has ever seen. The real targets are political dissidents and those escaping taxes in the underground economy. No one will be allowed to earn or buy or sell without his ID card, nor will they be allowed to leave the country or even migrate to another city. If any government agency has reason to red flag an individual, his card will not clear any transaction, and he will be blocked from virtually all economic activity and geographical movement. It is the ultimate control. The new money offers the cabal yet one more benefit. There can never be another run on the bank because it is now illegal to demand currency. The rise of revolutionary movements. Hyperinflation is fertile ground for the seeds of revolution. Economic despair led the masses to grasp at the promise of Lenin in Russia and at Hitler in Germany, at Mussolini in Italy, and Mao in China. It has now been 3 years since that fateful run on the banks in New York, and inflation has not been abated, even with the introduction of the Bancor. Now we are witnessing massive public demonstrations in every major city for higher wages, for more jobs, larger government benefits, for more stringent price controls. Since there are practically no goods in the stores at any price, the demonstrators are also calling for higher output from government factories. The demonstrations have been organized by radical organizations advocating the overthrow of the decadent capitalist system and the enthronement of socialists in its place. The participants in the street do not understand the words that they chant. They are unaware that capitalism has been dead in America for many years and that it is socialism that they already have. Nevertheless, there are tens of thousands of desperate people who are attracted to the rhetoric of revolution. Terrorism and revolutionary insurgency have become common occurrences in most major urban areas. The ranks of the revolutionaries are swelled by those who come solely for the looting that always follows. People are frightened by these violent events and demand restoration of the restoration of law and order. They are relieved when martial law is declared. They are relieved when martial law is declared. They are happy to see the intra-National Guard patrolling their neighborhoods. They are not resentful of being confined in their homes. They are not resentful of being confined in their homes or arbitrarily detained by soldiers. They are actually grateful for the omnipresence of the police state. It is curious that the revolutionary groups behind this violence have not been inhibited by the government. To the contrary, they have been given grants from the CFR organizations, and their leaders have been treated courteously by the CFR politicians, the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations media has given them extended coverage in the news and has presented their cause with sympathy. A few dissidents have begun to wonder if the revolutionaries are but unknowing pawns in the power A few dissidents have begun to wonder if the revolutionaries are but the unknowing pawns of those in power, and that their primary function is to frighten the population into accepting the constraints of the police state. So a little note from the narrator here. I'll point out that having been written in 1994, it's rather prophetic. I just think a few of the sections happened out of order. But the idea that those sections happened at all in reality should scare you that the sections yet to come will also eventually come to pass. Hence my reading this tonight. Chapter 25 continues. Such voices, however, are quickly silenced. I'm going to go back and reread that a second. So, a few dissidents have begun to wonder if the revolutionaries are but the unknowing pawns of those in power, and that their primary function is to frighten the population into accepting the constraints of the police state. Such voices, however, are quickly silenced. Those who question the government or the media are branded as extremists at the lunatic fringe. Authorities say that they are the cause of our present woes. They are remnants of the old system based on profit-seeking and race-hating. They are guilty of politically incorrect attitudes and hate crimes. They are sentenced to attitude correction centers for psychological treatment and rehabilitation. Those who do not immediately recant are never seen again. The homes are nationalized. One of the first industries to feel the raw power of the, quote, emergency measures was the home industry. During the early stages of inflation, people were applying their increasingly worthless dollars to pay down their mortgages. That was devastating to the lenders. They were being paid back in dollars that were worth only a fraction of the ones that they had lent out. The poor babies. The banking crisis had caused the disappearance of savings and investment capital, so the banks were unable to issue new loans to replace the old loans. Besides, people were afraid to sell their homes under such chaotic times, and if they did, very few were willing to buy with interest-bearing rates that high. Old loans were being paid off, and new loans were not replacing them. The savings and loans, which in the 1980s had been in trouble because home prices were falling, were now going broke because home prices were rising. Congress applied the expected political fix by bailing them out and taking them over. But that did not stop the losses. It merely transferred them to the taxpayer. To put an end to the losses, Congress passed the Housing Fairness and Reform Act. It converted all Bancor-denominated contracts to a new unit of value called the fairness value, which is determined by the National Average Price Index. On Fridays of the preceding week, hold on a second. Let's see here. Okay. So Congress passed the Housing Fairness and Reform Act. It converted all Bancor-denominated mortgage contracts to the new unit of value called the fairness value, which is determined by the National Average Price Index on Fridays of the preceding week. This has nothing to do with interest rates. It relates to the Bancor values. For the purposes of illustration, let us convert Bancors back into dollars. A $50,000 loan on Friday became a $920,000 loan on Monday because of inflation. Few people could afford the new payments. Thousands of angry voters stormed the Capitol building in protest. While the mob shouted obscenities outside, Congress hastily voted to declare a moratorium on all mortgage payments. By the end of the day, no one had to pay anything. The people returned to their homes with satisfaction and gratitude for their wise and generous leaders. That was only an emergency measure to be handled on a more sound basis later. Many months have now passed, and Congress has not dared to tamper with the emergency measure which ended paying your mortgage. The voters would, of course, throw them out of office if they tried. Millions of people have been living in their homes at no cost, except for county taxes, which were also beyond the ability of anyone to pay. Following the lead of Congress, the counties also declared a moratorium on their taxes, but not until the federal government agreed to make up their losses under terms of the newly passed Aid to Local Governments Act. Renters are now in the same position because virtually all rental property has been nationalized, even that which had been totally paid for by their previous owners. Under the Housing Fairness and Reform Act, it is not fair for those who are buying their homes to have an advantage over those who are renting. Rent controls made it impossible for apartment owners to keep pace with the rising costs of maintenance and especially their rising taxes. Virtually all rental units have been seized by county governments for back taxes. And since the counties themselves are now fully dependent on the federal government for most of their revenue, their real estate has been transferred to the federal agencies in return for federal aid. All of this was pleasing to the voters who were gratified that their leaders were at least doing something to solve their problems. It gradually became clear, however, that the federal government was now the owner of all their homes and apartments. The reality is that people are living in them only at the pleasure of the government. They can be relocated to other quarters if that is what the government wants. Wage and price controls and work armies. Meanwhile, the UN Wage and Price Stabilization Agency has instituted wage and price controls to combat inflation. What few businesses were able to survive the ravages of inflation are knocked out by these measures. Vital industries have been seized by the UN Wage and Price Stabilization Agency and prevented from closing their doors. When employees refuse to work for low, fixed wages or to take jobs assigned to them, they are placed under arrest and convicted of anti-democratic activities. Given the choice between prison or volunteering for the UN Full Employment and Environmental Restoration Army, most of them choose to join the army. They are now doing the work prescribed for them in return for food and shelter. Many have been reassigned to new jobs, new cities, and even new countries, depending on the employment quotas established by the United Nations International Human Resources Allocation Agency. Their families have been given living quarters which are appropriate to their work status and their willingness to cooperate. Automobiles are now used only by the ruling elite, who hold government positions of authority. To the extent possible, workers have been relocated to barracks, which were constructed within walking distance of major industries. Others use rapid transit systems, which have been greatly expanded under the Full Employment and Environmental Restoration Army. For middle management and the more skilled workers who are allowed to live in the suburbs, there are the People's Van Pools, that shuttle them to and from assigned boarding areas. Last week, Maurice Strong, who is now the director of the International Human Resources Allocation Agency, he toured. I think he gets to the torture later. Maurice toured the 15 regional subdivisions that have been carved out of the North American continent, including the former United States and Canada, and expressed gratification that America, at last, has ceased to be an aggressor against the world. Last week, Maurice, who is now the director of the International Human Resource Allocation Agency, toured the 15 regional subdivisions that have been carved out of the North American continent, including the former United States and Canada, and expressed gratification that America, at last, has ceased to be an aggressor against the world. Another 20 years have slipped by, and now we find ourselves in the New World Order. No one around us is sure exactly where it began. In fact, there was no official starting date, no announcement in the media, no ceremony with blaring trumpets. Sometime during the past 10 or maybe 15 years, it became obvious that it just was, and everyone accepted it as the natural evolution of political trends and necessities. Now, a whole generation is in place that has no memory of any other way of life. Many of the older folks have all but forgotten the details of their previous existence, and of course, many of them have been eliminated. Schools and textbooks speak of a bygone era as one unbridled competition, selfishness, and injustice. Schools and textbooks speak of the bygone era as one of unbridled competition, selfishness, and injustice. Previously, commonplace possessions such as automobiles and private homes and 3 pairs of shoes are hardly mentioned, and when they are derided as wasteful artifacts of a decadent society that, fortunately, has now ceased to exist. No taxes, no inflation, no depressions. The public is no longer concerned over high taxes. For the most part, there are none. Everyone works for the government, directly or indirectly, and is paid by electronic transfer to a government-regulated bank, which controls all spending accounts. Even those large corporations which have been allowed to maintain the appearance of private ownership are merely junior partners of the government. They are totally regulated and at any time totally protected from failure. The amount each citizen receives for his labors is determined by his technical usefulness and his political rank. His taxes are pleasantly low or non-existent. The cost of government is now derived almost entirely from expansion of the money supply and from the economic value of the work battalions. Each regional government of the world determines its spending needs and then offers to sell bonds in the open market to raise the money. The World Bank, acting as the United Nations Central Bank, is the primary buyer. The bank determines how much money to allow each regional government and then purchases that amount of bonds. It accomplishes that by making electronic transfers of credits to one of its correspondent banks within the region. Receiving the money. Once that has happened, the local government can draw upon these credits to pay its bills. Not a single tax dollar is needed for any of that. The International Monetary Fund / World Bank simply creates the money and the regional government spends it. In days gone by, this increase in the money supply would have caused prices and wages to go up almost immediately. Not anymore. Prices and wages are controlled. What does happen, however, is that the government is caught up in its own trap. It needs to keep the workers happy, giving them wage increases. But it also needs to keep its factories functioning by allowing price increases as well. The wage price spiral, therefore, is not eliminated. It is merely delayed by a few months. And instead of happening in its response to the interplay of supply and demand in a free market, it is directed by bureaucratic formulas. The end result is the same either way. The people of the world are still paying the cost of their international and local governments through the hidden taxation called inflation. In the chaotic past, the industrialized nations of the world went through phases of disruptive inflation, often exceeding 1,000% per year. That served a purpose in helping to destroy public faith in their existing national governments. It softened them up and made them more willing to accept drastic changes in their lifestyle and their political institutions. It paved the way to the New World Order. But now we have arrived, and extreme inflation rates, at least in the absence of war, would cause public dysfunction and be counterproductive. Inflation, therefore, has now been institutionalized at 5% per year. That has been determined to be the optimal level for generating the most revenue without causing public alarm. 5%, everyone agrees, is moderate. We can live with that, but we will tend to forget that it is 5% per year forever. A 5% devaluation applies not only to the money earned this year, but to all that is left over from previous years. At the end of the first year, the original dollar is worth 95 cents. At the end of the second year, it is reduced by another 5%, leaving its worth at only about 90 cents, and so on. After 20 years, the government will have confiscated 64% of every dollar we saved at the beginning of our careers. After working 45 years, the hidden tax on those first-year dollars will be 90%. The government will take virtually all of them over our lifetime. Current income and earned interest will partially offset this effect, but it will not alter the underlying reality of government confiscation. The effects of modest 5% inflation. For the past 50 years, all the published charts illustrating the decline of the dollar from such and such date to present show the following type of curve. For those of you who can't see the book, it is a graph showing a exponentially decreasing curve starting at $1 on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. And as the years increase, the line closes in on 0. These, of course, are averages. These, of course, are averages. A few people in the middle class of the bureaucracies will have managed to place some of their dollars into tangible assets or income-producing securities, what few still remain, where they are somewhat protected from the effects of inflation. For the vast majority, however, inflation hedges constitute but a tiny, tiny fraction of all that they have earned over a lifetime. And so we find that in the New World Order, inflation has been institutionalized at the modest level of 5%. Once every 5 or 6 generations, as prices climb higher and higher and higher, a new monetary unit can be issued to replace the old in order to eliminate some of the zeros. Little side note here. One of the stories I didn't pull up was about 2 months ago, Venezuela passed a new law in which all of their currency was to have 6 zeros lopped off the backside of it. The currency is still worthless, but now a $1 million bill in Venezuelan bolivar is now 1 Venezuelan bolivar. Back to the book. Let's see here. So a new monetary unit can be issued to replace the old in order to eliminate some of the zeros. But no one will live long enough to experience more than one devaluation. Each generation is unconcerned about the loss of the previous one. Young people come into the process without realizing that it is circular instead of linear. They cannot comprehend the total because they were not alive at the beginning, and they will not be alive at the end. In fact, there need not even be an end. The process can continue forever. By this mechanism, and with the output of work battalions, governments can operate entirely without taxes. The lifetime output of every human being is at its disposal. Workers are allowed a color TV, state-subsidized alcohol, and recreational drugs, and violent sports to amuse them. But they have no other options. They cannot escape their class. Society is divided into the rulers and the ruled, with an administrative bureaucracy between them. Privilege is now largely a right of birth. The worker class, and even most of the administrators, serve masters whom they do not know by name. But serve they do. Their new lords are the monetary and political scientists who created and whom now control the new world order. All of mankind is now in a condition of high-tech feudalism. High-tech feudalism. Inflation is not the only aspect of economic chaos that is now under control. Booms and busts in the business cycle are also a thing of the past. Like direct taxes, there are no business cycles anymore. Now that the government has firm control over every economic checkpoint, business cycles simply are not allowed. There is no speculation in the market because no one has the funds with which to speculate. There are no expansions of inventories or capital goods in order to maximize future profits because inventories are now determined by a formula. Besides, profits are also determined by a formula now, and although they are just large enough to keep pace with inflation, they are guaranteed. Chaos in the economy is now impossible because it is not tolerated. Neither is a depression. Yes, there are hundreds of millions of human beings living under conditions of extreme hardship, and thousands die of starvation every day, but depressions have been outlawed. No politician, no author, no one in the media would dare to suggest that the system was in failure. I have an interesting thought. If you, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about current events, but just can't help myself. The Biden administration stating unequivocally that it is their official position that there are no Americans stranded in Kabul, while there are clearly Americans stranded in Kabul. Yet it has all but been declared illegal for them to be stranded, so they are not stranded. I'm going to reread that a little bit. Chaos in the economy is now impossible because it is not tolerated. Neither is a depression. Yes, there are hundreds of millions of human beings living under conditions of extreme hardship. 1,000 die thousands die of starvation every day, and desperations and depression. Sorry, thousands die of starvation every day, but depressions are outlawed. No politician, no author, no one in the media would dare suggest that the system was in failure. Each month, the government releases new statistics showing some obscure way or another that the economy is steadily improving. Although there are people starving everywhere, hunger does not exist anymore. Although work battalions are crammed into flimsy barracks and tents, and although older homes and apartment buildings are falling down for lack of maintenance, forcing more and more families to share their tiny, unheated dwellings, nevertheless, the housing shortage is officially being eliminated. There are no more problems in the economy because problems in the economy are now illegal. Let's see here. So this chapter is part of a series of chapters in which the author uses a conceptual time machine to go through different historic events that give us kind of context for what's happening currently throughout the past century, and then also throughout this fictionalized future story. So that's why what I'm about to read is talking about a time machine, because that is a mechanism that the author uses as kind of a literary device throughout the book. Voices from the past. There is a message flashing on the front panel of our time machine. It reads, "Duplicate sequence in memory bank. Check years 1816, 1831, 1904, and 1949. It tells us that the onboard computer has found a similarity between what we are now viewing in the future and something that was recorded in the past. We had better check it out. On your keyboard, type send data to printer and press the key labeled execute." The first item is coming out of the printer now. It is a warning. In the year 1816, Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Sam Kercheval, in which he said, quote, we must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessities and our comforts, in our labors and in our amusements, our people must come to labor 16 hours in the 24-hour day, given our earnings of 15 to the government. Have no time to think, no means of calling our mismanagers to account, but be glad to obtain sustenance by hiring ourselves out to rivet their chains on the necks of our fellow sufferers. And this is the tendency of all human governments, till the bulk of society is reduced to be mere automations of misery. And the forehouse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that, and in this train of wretchedness and oppression. Thomas Jefferson was very prescient. Here is the second printout, in which a political commentary and prophecy in the year 1831, a young Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville toured the United States to prepare an official report for his government on the American prison system. His real interest, however, was the social and political environment in the New World. He found much to admire in the America, but he also observed what he thought were the seeds of its destruction. Upon his return to France the following year, de Tocqueville began work on a 4-volume analysis of the strengths and weaknesses he found. His perspective was remarkable, and his work, entitled Democracy in America, has remained as one of the world's classic works on political science. This is in part what our computer has recognized as a duplicate sequence. From de Tocqueville, quote, "The Americans hold that in every state the supreme power ought to emanate from the people. But when once that power is constituted, they can conceive, as it were, no limits to it, and they are ready to admit that it has the right to do whatever it pleases. The idea of rights inherent in certain individuals is rapidly disappearing from the minds of men. The idea of the omnipotence and sole authority of society at large rises to fill its place." Wow, de Tocqueville saw that in 1831. Jesus. We didn't really hang on to that Bill of Rights very long, did we? De Tocqueville continues, "The first thing that strikes the observation is an innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to produce the petty and paltry pleasures which they glut their lives with. Each of them, living apart, is a stranger to the fates of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute him the whole of mankind. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing." You guys, we wonder how we got here. And you got about 190 years ago, 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville, 190 years ago, saw the seeds of its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. I'm going to get a t-shirt with that on it. All right, de Tocqueville continues, "After having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned him at will, the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rulers, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot perpetrate." Kind of translate that back to contemporary English. So the power of the government will spread across society a series of miniature uniform rulers. So that would be like your big city mayors, your BLM town council members, even your teachers' unions. Just frustrate society with tiny tyrants. Not big ones, just a multitude of miniature ones. And in covering society in a miasma of tiny tyrants, even the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, which means that your great thinkers, your men of high moral character, are unable to rise up because they are choked down by the miasma of multitudes of petty tyrants, of tiny petty tyrants. I'll reread that a little bit. So de Tocqueville continues, "After having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned him at will, The supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rulers, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by its act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies the people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is its shepherd. Jesus Christ, de Tocqueville. I gotta read more de Tocqueville. He was rather on point, having been from 190 years ago. Which, interestingly, de Tocqueville was there when Joe Biden was first sworn into Congress. That's a little known fact. It's a Direwolf Media exclusive. De Tocqueville continues. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions. They want to be led and they wish to remain free. That's true. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole tutelary and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They wish to be led and to remain free, so they devise a sole and tutelary, all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite. They console themselves for not being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. They console themselves for being in tutelage by reflection that they have been able to choose their own guardians. Every man allows himself to be put in leaden strings, and every man allows himself to be put in leading strings because he sees that it is not a person or a class of persons, but of the people at large, who hold the end of his chain. By this system, the people shake off their state of dependence just long enough to select their masters and then relapse into it again. Every 4 years we do this. Sometimes every 2. By this system, the people shake off their chains. Let me reread this part here. I feel like this part's really important here. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. It gives them a respite. They console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. Every man allows himself to be put in leading strings because he sees that it is not a person or a class of persons, but rather the people at large who hold the end of his chain. By this system, the people shake off their state of dependence just long enough to select their master and then relapse into it again. Triumvirate, I went to public school. No, it wasn't required reading. Reading was barely required reading. All right. Education as a tool for human engineering. The third printout from our time machine computer is dated 1904, and it is a report issued by the General of Education Board, one of the first foundations established by John D. Rockefeller Sr. For the purpose of the foundation was to use the power of money, not to raise the level of education in America, as was widely believed at the time, but rather to influence the direction of that education. Specifically, it was to promote the ideology of collectivism and internationalism. The object was to use the classroom to teach the attitudes that encourage people to be passive and submissive to their rulers. The goal was, and is, to create citizens who are educated enough for productive labor under supervision, but are not educated enough to question the authority or to seek a rise above their class. True education was to be restricted to the sons and daughters of the elite. For the rest, it would be better to produce skilled workers with no particular aspirations other than to enjoy life. It was enough, as de Tocqueville phrased it, that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. The printout reads, the printout of the first publication of the General Education Board, Fred Gates explained the plan. Quote, "In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. They present educational conventions. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own good upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall try not to make these people or any of their children into philosophers of mental learning or of science. We have not to raise them from among authors. We have not to raise them from among the authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for an embryo of great artists, painters, musicians, nor of lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are, in their homes, in their shops, and on the farm." The Rockefellers, people. All right. Back to the future. So here is our fourth computer printout from the past. It is a satire and a warning. In the year 1949, George Orwell wrote his classic novel entitled 1984. In it, he portrayed the same futuristic scenes that now lie before us as we sit in our time machine. His only error appears to have been the date that became the title for his book. If he were writing it today, it is likely that he would call it 2054. Orwell described the world of our future as being divided into three regions: Oceania, Eurasia, East Asia. Oceania consists of the Americas plus England, Australia and the Pacific Islands, Eurasia. Oceania consists of the Americas plus England, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Eurasia is Russia, continental Europe. East Asia comprises China, Japan, South Asia Sea, and India. These superstates are constantly at war with each other. These wars are not fought to conquer the enemy. They are waged for the primary purpose of controlling the population. The wars are not fought to conquer the enemy. They are waged for the primary purpose of controlling the population. Maybe I was wrong at this. This wasn't a commentary on current events, or at least the most recently current events. Okay, so the wars are not fought to conquer the enemy. They are waged for the primary purpose of controlling the population. The people in all three territories tolerate their misery and oppression because sacrifices are necessary in times of war. Most of the stratagems outlined in The Report from Iron Mountain are to be found in Orwell's narrative. But Orwell described them first. The think tank was even willing to credit Orwell as the source of some of its concepts. For example, on the subject of establishing a modern, sophisticated form of slavery, the group at Iron Mountain said, quote, "Up to now, this has been suggested only in fiction, notably in the works of Wells, Huxley, and Orwell, and others engaged in imaginative anticipation of the sociology of the future. But the fantasies projected in Brave New World in 1984 have seemed less and less implausible over the years since their publication. The traditional association of slavery with ancient pre-industrial cultures should not blind us to its adaptability to advanced forms of societal organization." From this, we see that Orwell's work is far more than an entertaining novel. It is relevant to our present journey in time. Our would-be masters have studied him carefully, and therefore so should we. This is what he wrote. This is what Orwell wrote. "These three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it once was in the early decades of the 20th century. This is not to say that either the conduct of the war or the prevailing attitude towards it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as raping, looting, the slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners, which extend even to boiling and burying alive, are looked upon as normal. The primary aim of modern warfare is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. The machine is society's technical and industrial capacity to produce goods. From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, if the machine were used deliberately for that to end hunger, to end overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. But it was also clear that an all-around increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed, in some cases was the destruction of a hierarchical society. In a world in which everyone worked short hours and had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an airplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would have already disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. Such a society could not long remain stable, for if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become illiterate and would learn to think. If leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that they had privileged minority. Once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking into the depths of the seas materials which might otherwise have been used to make the masses too comfortable and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Think about that passage with what we just did in Afghanistan, leaving behind like $90 billion worth of equipment to avenge 3,000 Americans. We spent 20 years and ended it with abandoning five times 3,000, abandoning them to kidnapping and hostage situation in the same country. And the group that we went in to stop, we armed them with the latest and greatest in military industrial complex, and already talking about having to do flyover missions to use more military equipment to blow up the military equipment that we left behind. We're going to require some more of your tax dollars so that we can go blow up the tax dollars we already spent. Because if you had those tax dollars, well, I don't know, maybe you'd become too comfortable. Maybe you wouldn't have to go to work a second job or work a few extra hours at the job you do have. Or, I don't know, maybe you'd have enough money to run for office. Maybe buy a TV ad or, just maybe you could afford to tell your employer to screw off when he has certain mandates for you. But no, we took your dollars a couple of years ago, and now we're taking your dollars now to go blow up the dollars that we took a few years ago. So otherwise, you might get ideas. Orwell continues, in practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is chaotic shortage, with the result that there is chronic shortage of half of the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is a deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhat near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinctions between one group and another. The social atmosphere is that of the besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consequence of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem natural and an unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessity of destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and great pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for the hierarchical society. War, it will be seen, is now purely an internal affair, waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The function of waste in modern totalitarianism. Once again, it is clear from Orwell's grim narrative. Once again, it is clear that Orwell's grim narrative was a primary model for the report from Iron Mountain. The authors of the blueprint for Our Future spoke at length about the values of planned waste, as a means of preventing the masses from improving their standard of living. They wrote, quote, "The production of weapons of mass destruction has always been associated with economic waste. The term is pejorative since it implies a failure of function, but no human activity can properly be considered wasteful, and no human activity can be properly considered wasteful if it achieves its contextual objective. In the case of military waste, there is indeed a large societal utility. In advanced modern democratic societies, the war system has served as the last great safeguard against the elimination of necessary societal classes. As economic productivity increases to a level further and further above that of the minimal subsistence, it becomes more and more difficult for society to maintain distribution patterns, ensuring the existence of the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. The arbitrary nature of war, expenditure, and other military activities make them ideally suited to control these essential class relationships. The continuance of war system must be assured, if for no other reason, among others, than to preserve whatever quality and degree of poverty a society requires as an incentive, as well as to maintain the stability of its internal organizational power." So to kind of contextualize a little bit of this for what's currently going on, obviously the first part of this narrative was largely referring to the monetary system and how that was used to achieve power. And this kind of second segment that's taking a look back on historical events and historical writings is adding to that the monetary system is the method by which they control you, and the perpetual war system is the method by which they achieve certain economic aims that support the monetary system that they're implementing, and also to psychologically convince you that it's okay, that you're not being controlled, that this is something that you chose to do. It seems so this is an interesting chapter to have been written in 1994. So, let's see here. The chapter 25 from The Creature from Jekyll Island continues. These documents from the past and the imagined future can help us to better understand our present. The spectacle of wasteful government spending suddenly becomes logical. It is not stupidity that pays farmers to destroy their crops, or that purchases trillion-dollar weapon systems that are never deployed, or in some cases never completed, or that provides funding for studies of sex life of the tsetse fly, or that gives grants to pornographers posing as artists. The overriding object behind most of these boondoggles is to waste the resources of a nation. It is obvious by now that the decline in living standards in the West and the Western world is associated with the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. What is not so obvious, however, is that this is in accordance to a plan. To that end, massive waste in government spending is not an unfortunate byproduct. It is, in fact, their goal. That brings us back to the question of finding an acceptable substitute for war. War is not only the ultimate waste, it is also the ultimate motivation for human action. As Orwell said, waste in the absence of war would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. Will the environmental pollution model be able to sufficiently motivate human action as a substitution for war? No, but a virus was. That is not a safe assumption. The possibility of war in our future cannot be ruled out. The environmental pollution model is not yet thoroughly proven. It is working well for a limited purpose and on a limited scale, but it is still doubtful that it will ever equal the hysteria potential for physical war. The world planners will not abandon their use of war until the new model has been proven over many years. COVID was a test. It was a test to see if there was a replacement for war. That is why you're hearing so much battle and war and combat type rhetoric referring to coronavirus and in the fight against coronavirus and evoking patriotism, much as war does, evoking patriotism to justify certain actions for the coronavirus. I don't know if it'll work. I don't think the I think from the perspective of 1994, I think maybe environmentalism ended up being a flop. It looked like it was going to win for a while there, but I think it may have been a flop. But the virus appears to be at least an attempt. Whether or not it'll be successful or not is yet unknown. But it certainly seems to line up with the attempt at replacing war as the requirement for psychologically convincing you and also wasting your resources. I guess we'll find out. Let's see here. So the world planners will not abandon their use of war until the new model has proven over many years. On that point, the report from Iron Mountain was emphatic. When asked how best to prepare for the advent of peace, we must first reply as strongly as we can that the war system cannot responsibly be allowed to disappear until 1, we know exactly what we plan to put in its place, and 2, we are certain beyond a reasonable doubt that the substitute institutions will serve their purpose in terms of survival and sustainability of society. It is uncertain at this time whether peace will ever be possible. It is far more questionable that it would be desirable, even if it were demonstrably attainable. Thank you for the lemons from Wolf336 and Shit Meme Dank Post. Much appreciated. Let's see here. I believe we got about 4 more pages here. Thank you again for the lemon. All right, so regionalism as a transition to world government. The coalescing of the world's nations into 3 regional superstates was already visible even before we activated our time machine. The first steps had been strictly economic, but were soon followed by political and military consolidation. The European Union, including Russia, began with the issuance of a common money and eventually merged into a functional regional government. It was Orwell's Eurasia, even though it avoided calling itself that by name. Treaties binding Canada, the United States, Mexico, and South America formed the basic outline of Oceania, built around the Federal Reserve note as their regional money. Japan eventually became hostile to the West when trading was no longer her sole advantage, and along with China, which had been built up by the West, had been built up by Western aid and technology, and with India, which had been given atomic technology by the West, became the political center of Eurasia. Even as far back as the 1980s, it was known as Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Its monetary system was to be based on the yen. The people of the former nations were not yet ready for a giant leap into world government. They had to be led to that goal by a series of shorter and less frightening steps. They were more willing to surrender their economic and military independence to regional groupings of people who were closer in ethnic and cultural origin and who shared common borders. Only after several decades of transition was it possible to make the final merger. In the meantime, the world has plunged alternatingly between war and peace. After each cycle of war, the population was more frightened, impoverished, and collectivized. In the end, world government was irresistible. By that time, the environmental pollution model and alien invasion model had been perfected to provide high levels of human motivation. But even then, regional uprisings were occasionally engineered and when necessary to justify massive peacekeeping operations. War was never fully abandoned. It remained, as it always had been, a necessity for the stabilization of society. Even then, regional uprisings were occasionally engineered. Who founded the Taliban? Who founded ISIS? Who's gonna found the next thing to go after the Taliban and whatever the hell ISIS-K is? But even then, regional uprisings were occasionally engineered when necessary to justify massive peacekeeping operations. War was never fully abandoned. It was reimagined, as it always had been, a necessity for the stabilization of society. So, how fixed is this fictionalized future? Let us return now to the present, which, unfortunately, at the time of writing was 1994. Maybe if we could go back to 1994, we could avert a few more of these things. But let's continue reading anyways with that in mind. That when he says let's go back to the present, he's talking about 17 years ago. Let us now return to 1994, from which we departed, and reflect upon our journey through time. The first thing that strikes us is that we cannot be certain the future will unfold exactly as we have seen it. There are too many variables. When we originally set our primary assumption selector to present trends unaltered, we left the secondary assumption selector where it was. It was pointing to a banking crisis. Had we chosen the next position, no banking crisis, our journey would have been very different. We would not have seen long lines of depositors or panic buying in the stores or closing of the stock markets, but we would still have witnessed the same scenes of despair in the more distant future. We merely would have traveled a different path of events to get to that ultimate future. The forces driving our society into global totalitarianism would not change one iota. We would still have the doomsday mechanisms at work. We would still have the Council on Foreign Relations in control of the centers of government and the media. We would have an electorate which is unaware of what is being done to them and therefore unable to resist it. Through environmental and economic treaties and through military disarmament to the UN, we would witness the same emergencies of the world. We would witness the same emergencies of a world central bank, a world government, and a world army to enforce its dictates. Inflation, wage, and price controls would have progressed more or less the same, driving consumer goods out of existence and men into bondage. Instead of moving towards the New World Order in a series of economic spasms, we would merely have traveled a less violent path and achieved exactly the same destination. There is little doubt that the master planners would prefer to follow the more tranquil route. Patient gradualism is less risky, but not everything is within their control. Events can still get out of hand, like electing Trump, and powerful economic forces can become suddenly unleashed. Banking crises can occur even without being deliberately caused. On the other hand, the banking cabal also knows that crises are useful in driving the masses into the corral faster than they would otherwise move. Therefore, the application of some kind of scientifically engineered crisis cannot be ruled out. It would take many forms: ethnic violence, terrorism, plague, even war itself. I wrote this in 1984. This was before coronavirus pandemic. It was before 20 years of war in Afghanistan. It was before the financial collapse of 2008. It was before a couple of planes hit the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon and a field in Pennsylvania in 1994. On the other hand, the banking cabal knows that the crises are useful in driving the masses into the corral faster than they would otherwise move. Therefore, the application of some kind of scientifically engineered crisis cannot be ruled out. It could take many forms: ethnic violence, terrorism, plague, even war itself. I forgot to add in there the Antifa violence of the last 18 months, the Black Lives Matter riots and terrorism of the last 4 years. But none of that makes any difference. It would not alter our direction of travel through time. It would only determine our specific route. Like a flowing river, it may be diverted this way or that by natural barriers, or even by man-made channels, dikes, dams, but it will eventually reach the sea. Our concluding reflection, therefore, is that it is relatively unimportant whether there will be a banking crisis or other cataclysmic events. Well, we don't got to worry about that being from the future as relative to this book. We had all of them. All of the possible cataclysmic events he listed, we've had all of them. We've had ethnic violence, we've had terrorism, we've had plague, and we've had war itself. So I don't know if when he was talking about the past possible routes to the ultimate future, if he imagined that we would just take all of them at once, but here it is. Here we are. Did a great job the last 17 years. Good job, America. Just did the best we could. He continues, these are all secondary assumptions which are meaningless. Our only real hope for averting the new feudalism of the future is to change the primary assumption. We must change it to read present trends reversed. A pessimistic scenario of future events includes a banking crisis followed by a government bailout and the eventual nationalization of the banks. The final cost is staggering and is paid with money created by the Federal Reserve. It is passed on to the public in the form of inflation. Further, inflation is caused by the continual expansion of welfare programs, socialized medicine, entitlement programs, and interest on the national debt. The dollar is finally abandoned as the de facto currency of the world. Trillions of dollars are sent back to the United States by foreign investors to be converted as quickly as possible into tangible assets. You guys been hearing about the rapid increase in housing prices lately? It's not because people like you and me are buying houses. It's because people from other countries and banks and hedge funds and really rich people, they want to get rid of their dollars. And so they come back to America and they buy stuff. And then now you can't. That causes even greater inflation than before. So massive is the inflationary pressure that industry and commerce grinds to a halt. Barter becomes a means of exchange. America takes her place among the depressed nations of South America, Africa, and Asia, mired together in economic equality. Politicians seize upon the opportunities and offer bold reforms. The reforms are more of exactly what created the problem in the first place: expanded governmental powers, new regulatory agencies, and more restrictions on freedom. But this time, the program begins to take on an international flavor. The American dollar is replaced by a new United Nations currency, and the Federal Reserve System becomes a branch of the World Bank. Electronic transfers gradually replace cash and checking accounts. This permits the United Nations agencies to monitor the financial activities of every person in the world. A machine-readable ID card is used for that purpose. If an individual is red flagged by any government agency, the card does not clear and he is cut off from all economic transactions and travel. That is the ultimate control. Increasing violence in the streets from revolutionary movements and ethnic clashes provides an excuse for martial law. The public is happy to see United Nations soldiers checking ID cards. The police state arrives in the name of public safety. What's interesting about that part is a lot of people on both sides, well, on the right, were screeching for Trump to deploy the National Guard for the race riots last summer. And even on this channel, we entertained the idea. I didn't like it. I eventually gave in to thinking I thought maybe it'd be a good idea. And rereading this here, it's interesting, right? Because, well, that's the obvious thing to do, is restore law and order. And Trump didn't do that. And the powers that be did for DC. Joe Biden did when he got into office, deployed 25,000 military National Guard, which is 10 times more than what were in Afghanistan for the evacuation. He deployed 25,000 troops to DC, which is in theory what the conservatives and people on the right wanted to happen, what we wanted Trump to do all summer. And I don't know, rereading this makes me think maybe there's a reason why Trump didn't pull that lever, is because he knew it couldn't be unpulled. And I think that's probably correct. That's probably the correct thinking, as tempting as it is, as possibly even necessary as it is. Once you pull that lever, you can't unpull that lever. The summary continues. Eventually, all private dwellings are taken over by the government as a result of bailing out the home mortgage industry. Which is interesting because it started with the renters this time. We still have rents are being pushed back forever still. Rental property is also taken, as former landlords are unable to pay their property taxes. Yep. So during the rent moratorium, property owners still had to pay property taxes even though they weren't allowed to collect rents. People are allowed to live in these dwellings at reasonable cost or at no cost at all. It gradually becomes clear, however, that the government is now the owner of all homes and apartments. People are living in them only at the pleasure of the government. The government can reassign them to other locations at any time. Wages and prices are controlled. Dissidents are placed into work armies. There are no more autos except by the ruling elite. Public transportation is provided for the masses, and those with limited skills live in government housing within walking distance of their assigned jobs. Men have been reduced to the level of serfs who are subservient to their masters. Their condition of life can only be described as high-tech feudalism. There is no certainty that the future will unfold exactly in that manner because there are too many variables. For example, if we have assumed that there will not be a banking crisis, then our journey would be different. We would not see long lines of depositors or panic buying at the stores or closing of stock markets, but we would still witness the same scenes of despair in the more distant future. We merely would have traveled a different path of events to get there. That is because the forces driving our society into global totalitarianism would not have changed one iota. We would still have all the doomsday mechanisms at work. We would still have the Council on Foreign Relations in control of the power centers of our government and the media. We would have an electorate which is unaware of what is being done to them and therefore unable to resist it. Through environmental and economic treaties and through military disarmament to the UN, we would witness the same emergence of the world central bank, a world government, and a world army to enforce its dictates. Inflation and wage and price controls would have progressed more or less the same, driving consumer goods out of existence and men into bondage. Instead of moving towards the New World Order and a series of economic spasms, we would merely have traveled a less violent path and arrived at the exact same destination. Well, that was chapter 25. That was chapter 25 from the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, which was written by G. Edward Griffin, I believe in conjunction with a few other people. I have actually a long time ago read this book, and it's not a short read. I would recommend getting it on audiobook. The end of this chapter was on page 564, and this is not a tiny paperback book. It is almost textbook sized. So I would recommend at least reading through some cliff notes on it. Maybe there's another chapter after chapter 25, chapter 26, which has a similar story from the future, but under the assumption that we get rid of the Federal Reserve and take back our money system and kick all of the elites out of office and all that lovely stuff. Given that that chapter was written 17 years ago and that so many of the plot lines have come to pass, and also that it's been an hour and a half. Actually, it's been 2.5 hours. That was a lot of reading, guys. I hope you appreciated it and had as much fun listening to it as I enjoyed reading it. Yeah, so I haven't read I didn't read the next chapter because I think that's not the future that we're headed towards. And I don't know if this was, I've wanted to read this for a while. It's kind of like an extra show because it kind of seemed like we were racing towards this, especially with a lot of the economic developments the past 18 months with COVID and all that sort of good stuff. And seeing a lot of stuff that's happening lately, I was reminded of this chapter. And I've gone back to this chapter. I've only read the book once, but I've read this chapter, I think it's probably my 5th time going through it, because I like the way that it gives a narrative to what we can expect. Now, if you want to see the justification for why we can expect those things, well, that's the previous 24 chapters, which, again, I encourage you to at least download the audiobook and listen to it as like a podcast at your leisure. It's got a lot of very good history in it. The book has a lot of excellent history about our founding fathers and what our founding fathers thought about central banking and their fights against it. It's got the history and descriptions of money, which let me back that up a second because it sounds pretty basic, right? Like, oh, it's got a description of money. No, you gotta listen to some of this stuff or read through some of this stuff. The money, the word money is it's one of those thick concepts. Sargon of Akkad says as Sargon of Akkad says, there's these thick concepts, but the word money in the modern parlance has become very thin. What are you talking about? Like my credit card, paper dollar. Like, what are you talking about? No. Money has this very thick concept as to like, what is money? Like fundamentally, what is money on a conceptual, philosophical, societal and economic framework level. Like, what is it? And this book does an excellent job of describing that and explaining it in a way that is approachable to people with economic degrees and without economic degrees. And then through that, it kind of builds you a foundation to understand what is it that central banking, what is it that the Federal Reserve is doing to the money that is exercising so much control over you, that has been able to engineer society such that it is, that has primarily been adjacently responsible for much of the violence that we've seen the past century. Contrary to what it might feel like now, we're in a bit of a lull period, but the last 150 years, really the last 200 years, have been exceptionally violent. Now it seems like, oh, well, it's the modern era. We've had a lot of technological increases. We've had a massive boom of populations, a lot of increase in living standards, but that has all come through, maybe not at the expense of, but it has come adjacent to some extreme violence. We've had, due to certain economic systems clashing with each other, we've had more people murdered in the last century than existed 2 centuries prior to that. You got 100 million people killed by communism and socialism, or national socialism. 100 million people killed last century, when 3 centuries prior there wasn't even 100 million people on the planet. So this book, I think it's still relevant, clearly. If it ever becomes not relevant, you can be assured that your standard of living would be improved substantially, because if this book suddenly stopped being relevant, then all of the structuralized oppression via the economic system and politics would not be a problem for you. If that stuff wasn't a problem, that's the only way that this book becomes less relevant. So again, I would encourage you guys to go out and seek it out. Again, the Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. It's a good read. But like I said, I've wanted to read this. I wanted to read this chapter to you guys for a while. One, it makes kind of a nice little side episode. It's a little bit fun to kind of hear the narrative, but also a little bit spooky to see. Wow, the stuff that's happening now. It was apparently highly predictable. And I think that one last part there where it said, maybe it wouldn't be a banking crisis. Maybe instead it would be ethnic clashes, or maybe it would be a pandemic, or maybe it would be a war, or maybe it would be terrorism. And he kind of imagined those as separate paths we could take to get to now. And you look at the last 20 years, and we took all those paths. In the last 20 years, we've had terrorism, we've had ethnic clashes, we also had a banking crisis, we've had terrorism and a plague. So we checked all of those boxes. So if there was if you were back in 1994 and I asked him, okay, let's say I'm in 2021, how do I know that we're not headed down this path? He would say, well, if you didn't have any terrorism, you didn't have any plagues, you didn't have any ethnic clashes, you didn't have any wars, then you're probably fine. You've probably averted going to the catastrophe, long-term future. And then I would say, well, actually, sir, we've had all of those. We had all 5. It's like the Infinity Stones of the apocalypse. We had all of those things, and he probably wouldn't believe me. But I think one of the key parts there is just looking at the war. War is a distraction. It's always been a distraction. Its 2 major purposes are to distract you from what's going on here at home, and also to consume your resources. If you weren't working the first 3 months of your year to pay your taxes, what could you do with your life? What would be different? If due to government programs, college wasn't $200,000 for 4 years, if the government had it subsidized gender studies and tsetse fly sexual behaviors and the universities, what kinds of people would be produced from that. If various, if a lot of other things hadn't happened, what could you do? If a lot of stuff wasn't wasted as it is, if they weren't pumping millions and billions of your dollars into these critical race theory conferences for government officials, what would you do if we hadn't bought 190 Black Hawk helicopters only to turn them over to the Taliban, which will ultimately be used to shoot at probably your kids or your grandkids at some point, or Humvees that will run them over at some point. Your grandkids, if they serve, will be shot and killed by U.S. weaponry we left behind last week. That's guaranteed. That's guaranteed. Maybe not all of them, but if they die while serving, it'll be from military equipment that we sent over there and just left behind there. What would your life be like if we hadn't been so wasteful? What would your kids' life be like if we weren't so wasteful? And I guess the better question is, what do we do about it? Well, I don't know. Actually, the chapter 26 actually has some things that we can do about that. But I fear that we are too far down the river right now for some of those changes to have taken place. I think that certain things like crypto maybe give you a second chance. Some of the other options to divert us from the current path we seem to be headed down. I think that the opportunity to avert those has long since passed. We failed a lot of the tests along the way. Certainly the terrorism test, we failed that. Certainly the ethnic clashes test, we're currently failing that. The pandemic test, we're failing that. The war test, we're not doing the best at that. The economic crisis, we started off the stream with just passed another 3.5 of stimulus, which is really 6.5. We're at 5% inflation per month. Now, interestingly, the future fiction said that 5% per year was moderate, and now we're begging for it to just stay at 5 per month, please. Just stay at 5% per month, please. If only it would stay at 5% per month, that would be moderate. And then we've got the whole story. This whole fictionalized story started off with a hiccup in the U.S. being able to pay back its debts, sending a shockwave through the financial system that ultimately unraveled it over the course of several weeks and months and years. And what are we having this month? Well, we're got the debt ceiling back, and we're bumping up against the debt ceiling. We're bumping up against the ability to whether or not we can pay our bills. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. We will be back. Direwolf will be back with me on Saturday. We'll be doing our weekly news recap. We have a few other stories other than the absolute debacle of Afghanistan. Don't mean to be super grim, but I hope you guys are ready for some videos next week. Not from our channel, from Afghanistan, because after next week, that's when the red line in the sand is, and the people that Biden administration has left behind. Well, there's going to be some videos of what's going to happen to them that I don't think anybody's prepared for. You can try to be prepared for it. I'd recommend attempting to prepare yourself for it. But there's going to be some stuff that's happening next week. It's going to be pretty awful. Let me, before I head out here, I'll read chat here a little bit. Let's see. Your Thought Criminal on YouTube says, Edward Griffin is a great writer. I'm glad you're taking the time to actually read this. Well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Shitmean Dank Post says, direct democracy is, the thing. It is. That is what direct democracy is. It's the thing. Let's see here. See you guys over here on D Live. Got Voracious Blackston. Let's see here. CC. Is that like CC? Sent us a lemon. I much appreciate the lemon. Are you a different CC or are you like the original CC? Let's see here. Catman's asking where the guillotines are. Let's see here. Yeah, a lot of discussion about what's going on here. But yeah, so again, book is Creature from Jekyll Island. I would encourage you to download it and either read it if paper books are your thing. I haven't read a paper book in, gosh, it's been years. So tonight was a special night for me. But obviously the format of this show is audio. So if that's more your style, this book's available as an audio version. I know it's available on Audible. So if you have an Amazon account or if you don't, you can just log into Audible for your trial period and download a free book. I would do that. If you do have to pay for it, if you've already got Audible, I assure you it will be the best like $10 you've ever spent to learn some of this stuff. So it's a very good learning book. And again, the history, not just teaching you the economic foundations of how does the current monetary system work under central banking, but also this extremely rich history of the founding fathers and what they were doing, and then different eras throughout American history as to what were they doing with the central banking. How did that influence the politics as America grew up the last 250 years? A lot of that history I didn't know. And it's unfortunate that I didn't know it. But I do now. And I don't regret it. So I would encourage everybody to read this book or at least listen to it. But with that said, this has been the Fox from Jekyll Island episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please let me know if you guys have any other suggestions for possible read-alongs. This one seemed to be particularly appropriate. But you guys have a great night and a great rest of your week. Hopefully you guys are staying safe. And stuff's not going to get better. I know it doesn't seem like a great way to end off the stream, but it's not going to get better. You gotta prepare yourself, or at least learn what's coming up so that you can prepare yourself better. But with that said, this has been Trevize, Fax Trevize. I am signing off. I'll be back with Direwolf on Saturday for our weekly news recap. Thank you so much for joining.